people in business want is success. So if you can figure out how to help generate winning and success, no matter where you are, it's going to lead you to the right spot.
I mean, you mansplained that perfectly, brother. That was a great closing by you.
I find that to be hysterical because if we did a Venn diagram on speaking, you talked a lot more than me today. I was going to give you some shit for mansplaining this one to me.
I typically do talk more than you, and that's more because I actually prepare for these rather than just showing up in my pajamas, you a-hole. That's nothing to do with mansplaining.
But look how comfortable I look.
This episode was born from a word that Frank's wife, Ellie, used to describe half of our arguments when she tells me that I am mansplaining her. And we initially were going to make fun of it, but as we dove deeper into it, we found the topic quite interesting, and it went much deeper than the idea of mansplaining. And what better place could you go to than two middle-aged white dudes to go learn about the difference in conversational style and linguistics between men and women? You're in the right place, let me tell you. We are ready to mansplain our way through this episode, and we may even surprise you with some of our findings. If you are new to this, please subscribe. And if you are a longtime listener and you have not given us that review, shame on you.
You're listening to Let Me Speak to a Manager with Frank Cava and Ian Mathews.
What a crock of shit.
Yeah, that was hot mic, Sam.
You can't say God on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Frankie!
Ian, you son of a bitch!
You mansplaining bastard.
So Ian and I thought this was going to be a fast episode or just a topic amongst another episode. I walked into the kitchen because I'm still in quarantine hell from COVID. And I got my wife who has a PhD in linguistics and who brings up mansplaining all the time to Ian and me. The first place Ian ever heard mansplaining was from my wife. So she went into a women's splaining session and told Ian and I all of the inner workings of mansplaining. And we ended up with a very dense agenda thanks to my wife.
Yeah. So to Ellie Cava's credit, I learned the word mansplaining from Ellie at a time where she thought I was mansplaining. So if you don't know what mansplaining is, I'm going to give you the definition that I found in some half-assed research on Google. Mansplaining is the explanation of something by a man, typically to a woman, in a manner regarded as condescending or patronizing. So initially, Frank and I were going to do a short episode, like 15 minutes, without an outline, where we were just going to rail against this as a bunch of liberal freaking garbage. We were going to say, that's bullshit. Women talk over men all the time, and men talk over men all the time. This is just male bashing bullcrap. Everyone does this. All this is someone who doesn't have enough emotional intelligence to not talk over somebody or know that they're not talking to someone who's an expert. So screw all of you liberal bastards who came up with this stupid term. There is no such thing as mansplaining. And as Ellie is like to do, I tend not to even like to get into intellectual conversations with your wife because one, she's smarter than me. Two, she reads more than me. Three, she almost never gets into an argument that she's not willing to die for. So she normally just outlasts me in most fights, even if I think I've got better facts. Four, I never actually have better facts. So the only way to beat her is by mansplaining. And five, she then tells me I'm mansplaining. So in this case, she was not argumentative. She got on a Zoom call with me and she very intelligently explained some of the back history of it. And rather than getting into mansplaining, Ellie enlightened both of us on a concept of conversational style. And this is something that I don't think Frank or I were really it wasn't really on our agenda. We hadn't thought too deeply about. But there is an author by the name of Deborah Tannen that Ellie asked us to go do a little research on. And very funny, at the end of this, she spent 15 minutes kind of summarizing it for Frank and I, because obviously we're cavemen and we need her to use words without many syllables. So we asked her to very quickly explain it like you were talking to a 6-year-old. But at the end, she said, I would go watch this TED Talk or this on YouTube. And both of us said, no, that'd take too long. We just want to mansplain our way through this.
So I want to bring this part of this up, right? So my wife and I have been together for like 7 years at this point, and she has brought home 2 books from Deborah Tannen. Deborah Tannen is a well-known author. The article that we are going to talk about today was written and published in 1995, October of 95. I was 20. To put this in perspective, it was a long time ago. And Deborah Tannen is a professor at Georgetown. So my wife actually studied under Deborah Tannen when she was getting her PhD in linguistics, which Deborah Tannen, basically Steven Pinker, are the only 2 people you ever hear of that are linguists that are like, fairly prominent. So the other part of this that's fascinating, Ian, is she's brought home 2 books. I've read neither of them.
Of course.
So why don't you just explain these to me?
Of course, just summarizing. Her 2 biggest books are That's Not What I Meant and You Just Don't Understand. And so Ellie was telling us 1995, that would have been right around the time that she was doing her first dissertation, which was on linguistic style. And linguistic style, so mansplaining, it's kind of a cute way of explaining when men are a little bit too aggressive or assume that the person they're talking to is not intelligent. Another cute way of saying it is manterrupting, which is another thing Frank and I were going to go off on and say that's stupid because women interrupt men all the time. I live this in my life. And we were also going to say that men interrupt men, women interrupt women. But linguistic style, if we just look at the basics of it, linguistic style refers to a person's characteristic speaking pattern. So it's features like how direct are you, how indirect are you, what's your pace, what kind of pauses do you use, what's your word choice, elements of conversation like jokes, figures of speech, stories, questions, apologies, all of those things. And gender plays a role. But before we get into gender, which I think is at the heart of what we're going to talk about today, linguistic style can also have a lot to do with geography, where people live, what they do. And that's something that Ellie was also getting into the details a little bit with us of the difference of how someone might talk in Mississippi versus California versus New York. Obviously a New Yorker is going to speak faster. They're going to interrupt each other more frequently, but that's not considered rude. That's considered their style, where they're pounding each other with lots of little questions and checking for acceptance a lot. And if someone from New York is talking to someone from, say, Texas, they might think of them as less intelligent or less interested because someone from that area is not going to speak that way. They're going to listen a little bit longer. They're going to pause longer before they speak. So they might not get much conversation in. There's just a big difference, I think, in different geographies. Whereas in the way Deborah Tannen explains it, Sally relocates from Texas to Washington, D.C., looking for a new job, and she can't break in the way she was in Texas. And part of the reason is in Texas, she was considered outgoing and confident, but in Washington, D.C., she's now perceived as shy and retiring, even to the point where her boss suggests taking an assertiveness training course, when really it's a difference of linguistic style, nothing to do with her assertiveness. It's just the way things are perceived in a different area. Frank, you were talking about Californians talking to you when you go out to your masterminds.
Yeah. So when I go to California or out west, a lot of the people always say, you're so East Coast. And I'm so East Coast because I'm a little bit more gruff. I'm a little bit more aggressive in style. I grew up around a ton of people that grew up in New York. So I'm fairly accustomed to speaking to people where there's high stakes. It's interruptive and not pause driven. So that's a big part of it. And what Ian did in his intro, which I think is a good thing, we were going to get into mansplaining and joke about it. And what we did instead is we looked at it and realized mansplaining is actually something much deeper. And linguistic style is part of it, which my wife brought up. But there's other components to it. Geography is part of it. We're going to get into a bunch of other things. In one of our recent shorts that we released, what we talked about was Jerry Seinfeld. And there was a commercial that ran in the 90s and early 2000s about Jerry Seinfeld using jokes that were from America, and he used them in Britain and they flopped. And the end of the commercial is he's using all these things that are like British slang and everybody's laughing because he's Jerry Seinfeld. But what's deeper than that, style is something that comes up along with content. And we don't really put a lot of emphasis on style. We don't put a lot of emphasis on those type of things. We kind of use jargon and short-term words and like abbreviations, which confuse people, but we don't really put much around the geography or the stylist. And I think Ian and I were really enlightened here on this topic because we thought we had a topic, and it turns out we have multiple topics. And as people who promote themselves as good managers and good leaders, as we read through this, we realized, holy crap, like these are things we've thought and never had the vocabulary for. These are things we've witnessed and didn't understand. These are things that we see taking place all the time. And Ian brought up a point, I'll let you talk about it. And we have statistics at the end that'll back this up in the half-assed internet research department. But one of the things that Ian mentioned in his life with mortgage, it's a lot of women, and it's more women than men. And compared to home building, which the side I was on is more men, and how different those sides of businesses run.
Yeah, in general, I had more talented women to choose from in the finance sector than you did in real estate, which is, tended to be more men. We talked about this we worked for a top 5 home building company in the country. And out of 70 division managers, which is a vice president position, there was one DM most of the time, 1 or 2. They just didn't make it up to that position. And I think in the amount of time that we studied this, I saw a lot of things that were holding women back, which were perceptions and misperceptions of the men that are running those companies, but also some things that they could probably change if they knew that about themselves and the way others were perceiving them. This started off as a joke, and it became something where we were like, oh man, we don't know much about this. We need to dive in. So I've learned quite a bit just by preparing for this outline. I think it's pretty fascinating. And I think one thing Ellie talked about in the concept of mansplaining is just the element in linguistic style of turn taking. And when I say turn taking, typically in a conversation, people take turns. So Frank and I, this entire podcast is a clash of 2 linguistic styles. Now, Frank and I are relatively close. We're friends. The more time we spend together, the more alike we are. But I talk, then Frank talks. One person responds, I respond. Sometimes Frank's not paying attention and I pause and I have to say, Frank, you should talk. But most of the time he understands when I'm not talking for a second or 2, it's his turn. That's the way it works. So that's...
And as we're going to talk about interruptions later, with the 2 of us being wired the way that we are often saying to ourselves, would you stop fucking talking so I can make my point now? Because I got a really good point. I want this to be a clip.
Well, this is interesting. So I brought this up to Ellie. I said, this whole mansplaining thing, Frank and I talk all the time and we're always interrupting each other. You just got to watch one YouTube clip of us doing an episode, and the 2 of us are fighting over who gets the microphone sometimes because both of us have an idea and we want to get it out there and we're afraid we're going to lose it. And so we interrupt each other. That's kind of our style. That's not, one of us is not a female. That's what we do with each other. And, she had some really good points and we'll dive into some of them, but in that turn taking, you take someone from Florida and you send them to New York and they have a conversation with someone, it might be hard for them to get a word in edgewise, because that slight pause, that they're used to, the New Yorker feels very uncomfortable when that pause comes up. And so they want to fill it as quick as they can. And it's interesting, Frank, I saw a lot of this. So when I first started right out of college, I was on a leadership program, which meant I got to fly around all over the country. So I'd be in South Carolina one week, and I'd be in Oregon the next, and I'd be in New York, and then I would be out in Missouri. And I saw this big time. Whereas if you'd meet with a high level person in Georgia and you'd go have lunch, and you were not supposed to talk business the first 20 minutes. It was really slow. I had to fight myself to not talk, because sometimes I would ask a question and they would just think for 3 or 4 seconds. Whereas in DC, you don't do that. It's weird. You think something's wrong. You think you want to repeat the question because that person must not have heard me if they're pausing that long. But a lot of that is just different linguistic styles by region. But by far, the biggest differences in linguistic style are gender based. And from what
before we get into gender, I just want to say something else. So I think we understand that when you're looking at different countries, they have different styles. I'm a big fan of Mad Men. Ian doesn't really like it as much as I do, but Mad Men takes place in the 60s. And one of the protagonists in the story fought in the Korean War. So he's got a problem with Japan and Korea because he fought in World War II and the Korean War. So the point of this is they end up doing business with both Japanese and Korean countries. And because of the war element, they didn't really think there was never the pause for respect that you would give to most normal people. And so this guy just butchered his way through a meeting, and it was painful. But the point is, we understand when we're dealing with different cultures that different countries have very different cultures. But sometimes what we don't stop to realize, especially when we're young, is these things are also geographic. Even in the US, where the rest of the world looks at us all the same, but Ian's point of a meeting in rural Georgia versus Atlanta are very different. So the conversational style on a farm in rural Georgia and 100 miles away in Atlanta take on very different tones and tacks. So you can be a bull in both instances, but if you're trying to get a sale, if you're trying to manage someone, if you're trying to actually succeed in business, we always talk about having to have more than just one pitch. This is when you need to have more than one pitch inside of our own country, even in the same state. It's a matter of making sure you understand the ground you're on and you are providing the right type of communication for the situation you're in.
So Frank, do you ever listen to Ellie talking about something where she's trying to find the most politically correct way to explain something to a group of girls that she's not in on? So they all have one idea and she just doesn't, like, let's say they all want to go to a restaurant and she doesn't want to go to that restaurant. And, you know, my wife will do this all the time. And I'll say, why don't you just say that restaurant sucks? I don't like it. She'll be like, I'm not a boy. That's what you would do. I'm like, well, why not? Just tell them that. And she's like, well, you know, that might hurt some people's feelings that suggested the restaurant in the first place. And I'm like, and then what? She's like, well, and there's hard feelings for a while. And I'm like, you know, guys are just so different. We'll assert ourselves like, nah, that place sucks. I don't like that place. We're not going there. That's a dumb idea. And no one takes it personal, but girls are so different. And a lot of it stems from, so understand everything I'm going to say largely comes from this one linguist researcher that we've studied all of her work. And these are generalizations. This is not saying that there's not exceptions, but in general, children learn their linguistic style from their groups of friends at a very young age, not so much parents, but from their friends that they interact with. And in general, boys play with boys and girls play with girls. There are exceptions, but I can say that was how I grew up. That's how Frank grew up. That's how my kids are growing up. I see this everywhere. There's boys play on boys sports teams, girls play on girls sports teams, girls hang out with other girls on the block. So they learn certain styles at a very early age. And sociologists study this, anthropologists study this, psychologists study this at the way children communicate. And they find that there are very different ways in which girls and boys build rapport and negotiate status. So, girls tend to learn conversation rituals that, and for the most part, your linguistic style is kind of in place by the time you're done with high school. So this all happens very early, and it's very hard to change any of it the rest of your life.
I would argue, Ian, it's even before the end of high school. Like literally some of this stuff is pre-kindergarten and adolescence for sure.
Yes, 100% elementary school, really. So girls tend to learn their rituals focusing on the rapport dimension of relationships, whereas in boys tend to learn rituals that focus on status dimension. So think about the alpha male in a wolf pack of men. That's kind of how boys operate. So a group of girls in general will ostracize a girl who calls attention to her own superiority, and they'll criticize her, saying she thinks she's all that. And, a girl who tells others what to do, who's a little too directive, and this is what we're doing today, is considered bossy. So girls learn to talk in ways that balance their needs with those of the group. So thus, my wife trying to be overly polite about saying, I don't like that restaurant. And half the time she'll go to the restaurant and just to keep the status quo because it seems like the group wants to do it. So whereas then a boy wouldn't think twice about saying, I don't like that place. Whereas and on the opposite side, so boys who hang on groups, they never accuse each other of being bossy because the leader in a group is expected to tell lower status boys what to do. So boys learn to use language to negotiate their status in a group by, displaying their abilities, their skills, their knowledge, challenging others, resisting challenges, giving orders, keeping their, everything's about status. You're either one up or one down. And so, they tell jokes, they tell stories, they brag a little bit. Boys are very physical in how they express themselves, especially in sports, whereas in boys tend to follow the best athlete, the one who's, tends to be pretty good. And so that's how they show off. So I think it's important, Frank, that we start with that, because I think almost everything else we're going to get into in this outline is based on social norms that boys and girls that are largely hanging out in gender specific cliques as they grow up, how they learn to communicate and what their norms are.
So there's a few things in here I want to talk through. So you'll find this funny. And I may have told you some of this story before. So my wife and I are married maybe, a year. Before kids, we're married a little while. And, things change. You get comfortable. The things you did when you date don't, some of it is, you're putting on your best face and, you kind of regress to the mean. When you kind of become yourself, you start scratching yourself publicly or doing things that you wouldn't have done at one point. You fart or burp a bit more than you used to.
Yep.
So my wife goes through, we're laying in bed, we're having a fun conversation, we're giggling. And she goes through her list of grievances, and there's 12 of them. And it's just like, ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. She just keeps smashing me with them. And I literally just giggled. I paused. And my reply was, you've become bossy. And that was it. And she burst out laughter. She's like, true. So when Ian talked about kind of what is and isn't socially acceptable with girls, clearly it's not the opposite when girls are talking to boys, especially their husbands. So there is a major sex element of all of this. The other thing that is fascinating that we know, but we just uncovered it in our research and are going to talk about it here, is the perception is very different between men and women too. A man could think that something is over and a woman doesn't. And one of the quotes that came up is they got into a fight and the woman said to the man, you're pretending this is over. And the man's response was, who's pretending it never happened? As puzzled by her question as she had been by his behavior. It happened, he said, and it's over. What she took as a literal fight to him was a routine of part of daily negotiation. It was just a ritualistic fight. So the sex thing happens and we kind of get comfortable in our groups, and then we're made to, in a Yahtzee sleeve, we get mixed around with all these other people in the work playground, and it's very different. And what you perceive is different. So something that I no longer perceive as an issue, someone else still perceives as an issue. When I was a young manager at Ryan Homes, one of the things they put me through was what was called situational leadership. Now, it didn't go into Deborah Tannen stuff, but it talked about, and they made you do all of these different exercises where you would physically speak to someone and they were scripted and you were saying things that were not the right thing to say at that moment and you knew it, but they made you go through the exercise because it was so uncomfortable, that pause. So what I read or learned in reading this and talking this through the To Build an Agenda, it really brought up that set of emotions that I had when I was in my mid-20s, kind of learning and kind of uncovering that this is real in the workplace. So there is the cultural, the geographic, the sexual part of this, and it's kind of what we all look at. And it's so hard to have empathy for others because you just don't think that way. You think everyone's like you. And that's what we're trying to drive at in this episode, is having empathy for others, realizing people have different perspectives is going to give you an unfair advantage in the workplace because most people don't understand it or can't articulate it.
So it's part of our conclusion that we're going to talk about, but I think it's important to drop it in right here. 60% of Americans with advanced degrees are women. Okay, so let that sink in. So in general, women are more qualified, more studied, more in general than men. Yet 72% of senior vice presidents in America are men. So less qualified, but more represented at the highest ranks. And the next thing we're going to talk about is who gets credit. And I think credit grabbing, there's an important piece of this that, I think comes down to linguistics, and I think it comes down to conversational style. So when Deborah Tannen went, for her dissertation, she studied businesses. She just would go to meetings and she would take notes and she would listen and she would observe, and she did this for years. And she would survey and study. And she found something pretty interesting, and that was the way in which men and women communicate in meetings and in group settings is dramatically different, and different in a way where the men get a unusual proportion of the credit. And so she used one example where she went to a meeting and her impression was the man in the meeting was responsible for most of the good suggestions that were adopted by the group. She kind of took some notes and said, Phil had some good ideas, blah, 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 blah. But as she went through and typed and looked at all of the notes and re-looked at it, she found that Cheryl, who was a female in this meeting, actually made most of the suggestions. And what she assumed the guy was doing was coming up with it. When she went back and looked at it, he was really just picking up on her points and supporting her. So she would say, hey, we should really look at taking some cost out in these two areas. And the guy would say, I really agree. She'd be quick to the point, have some good ideas. He would agree and then elaborate in greater length in supporting her idea. So to an outside observer, it looked like the man was coming up with all these ideas. And you could say, well, he's stealing her thunder. But that's really... Deborah Tannen did not say that he was stealing her thunder. He didn't believe that. This guy never claimed any of those ideas were his own. And in fact, she didn't feel that way. The girl that came up with all the ideas did not feel that way after the meeting when she was interviewed. In fact, she felt very appreciative that he had supported her, and it made her more confident to give more ideas in that meeting because another one of her peers who was a man was supporting her in it. But what's interesting is she also felt like everyone in the room knew those were all her ideas. And when Deborah Tannen went and interviewed everybody, what she found was the group felt the same way Deborah Tannen did, which was the guy had been giving a lot of great ideas in this meeting, and that wasn't the case. So this is one isolated example, but Deborah Tannen found it over and over and over again that because of conversational style, men tended to get more of the credit for ideas and actual work being done in an organization. And obviously, who gets credit is who gets promoted, is who gets paid more, who gets moved up the ladder, who gets moved up in status with people that are making decisions. And I feel like that was something that I found very interesting, in that, having worked for enough organizations where women were very underrepresented in leadership positions, that this little piece of conversational style could have a big impact on that.
So what I found interesting about this, and I don't disagree with anything you said, it's there was an exercise where at the end, they asked the men and they asked the women for their perspectives. And they interviewed an equal size group. The men all thought the man was the one who brought the most value. The women all thought the woman was the one who brought the most value. So I would go to two separate things: inherent biases that we're unaware of, or a conversational style that relates to my conversational style is the one that I think is the most impactful. So what happened here was an example, and this is cited in the article, is there was actually great teamwork. Cheryl felt as if Phil supported her and supported her very well. The peers heard they're the same sex more than they heard the other. What the two people that were contributing, it was actually an example of great teamwork. Ian and I, in one of our episodes about what pisses us off or annoys us, is the human echo. The human echo is someone who says, "That's a great point, Ian. I'd like to elaborate on that," and goes into it. That's the wrong way to do it. In this example, what I'm hearing is you have someone with great ideas and you have someone that has the pulse of the room, and collectively, the two of them put out a great message. So what I thought with the sexism part, though, this goes back to like Seinfeld, know your audience. If your audience is a certain way, maybe instead of just saying it one way, you pose it and you say something similar twice in ways that appeal to both sides of the room. And that's how you really can win over a room. I think that we've all seen speeches, and this is where this whole thing started with mansplaining. Ian and I were talking to my wife about it, and we were basically saying, it's people just talking at you is what it feels like. And I don't think that's men to women only. I see tone deaf people all the time that are pushing the wrong agenda and are trying to push it down your throat where they don't know how to adjust the message for the audience. So I felt the wrong way, but I've also seen it done insanely well where everyone's included. And I think in this credit grabbing example, what we saw here is that we saw a message being crafted together by two different people, two different sexes.
I think let's go back to the fact that 70% of senior management positions in companies are men. I think part of the problem that women are up against and why that percentage isn't getting better for them enough or fast enough is the men in the room saw him and his style, because that's what they're used to, as being very effective and him doing a great job. The women in the room saw her as coming up with great ideas and not bragging about herself, seeing it good. But what matters for who moves her up and who really moves it. Now, if the most senior level person in the room is a female and is responsible for helping promote you and move you up the chain, then obviously her style was great. Give an idea, be humble about it, don't brag on about it too much. But if it's men in the room, you have to think about that as a female. You have to think about the inherent bias of the person who's evaluating who came up with the ideas and who's adding value. And you have to try to figure out, how do I speak in a conversational style that a man is going to understand if that's the person who's going to be responsible for paying you more?
Absolutely is what I would say to all this, but I'm going to use two very different examples. So you see this in sports a lot. When the general manager gets fired, usually the coach and the quarterback go because it wasn't their people to pick. So when a new general manager comes in, there's usually a new coach and a new quarterback in football because the general manager wants to control that. They want to put things inside of their image. So in a lot of instances, there's just a purging. In the business world, what you'll see is that people, so in our line of work, we had divisions and we were regionalized or state, right? But you would rarely promote someone from the home building side into the mortgage because they're two different businesses, and vice versa. We rarely pluck someone from the mortgage business and put them into the home building business. But what you'll see in certain instances is, and this can work across the lines of sex, is people have their chosen teams. Like I've talked to one of my friends who's a senior executive at a publicly traded company, big company, and his boss picked him to be on a really high-end account. And when I was talking to him about it, he's like, well, I got my team too. So sometimes it's sex, but sometimes it's team specific and understanding the dynamics of the person. But if you want to make yourself more promotable, be relatable to the person who is your senior. And at the same time, if you're looking to like build your own team, who are the people who you communicate with the best? That's going to be the people who you tend to move along the chain.
Love it. So the words I versus we, what Deborah Tannen found in her research was women were much more likely to speak in terms of we, while men were much more likely to speak in terms of I. And what she also found is, for that reason, more people gave credit to men and less to women. So again, this comes back to social norms where, girls care very much about the overall perception of the group and not rising too high. I kind of, as I read a little bit about what it's like to be a girl in some of these groups, it's kind of like the crabs in the pot, where one crab starts to crawl out and get out of the pot, and the crabs reach up and grab that one and pull it back in so they could all be even around the same. It kind of feels that way. Trying to have parity at least. And so I think a lot of that is deep seated. And what Deborah also found is, and she said some of this is vanity, most women feel like people will know it's their work and that they don't need to brag and they don't need to claim it for themselves because most people will figure it out. And she said that was a fatal flaw in a lot of women who were not getting as far as they wanted, is they assumed that people would know always who was doing the real work. Whereas by speaking in terms of we, they were really just downgrading their work one down on the status chart. Whereas in men, were happy to give themselves more credit.
We've talked about this before. Like nobody ever comes in and said, I was the fifth person on the team doing this project. Everybody comes in, pound their chest and let you believe they're one or number two in every situation. And we all know that that is not the case. A few things here. So I remember being young, like working at the Outback, and I had managers that always—
There it is.
Yeah.
There it is. 36 minutes in.
Yeah. Who always would say we or our. And I had this guy come in and he said, this is mine. Like I. And I remember what a stark, I was 20 years old, 22 years old. I remember what a stark difference it felt like and how much less I wanted to work for that person than I wanted to work for others who was using more inclusive language. So differentiating yourself is part of this, but also managing is part of it. And I find that the we and us is a way more powerful language set than the I and my when you talk about anything, especially in leadership. And if you get high enough in leadership, what you start to realize is you get credit for nothing. It's only you that gets blamed. And that's okay. But that's part of the deal. The other thing is just a funny story that has a lot to do with I. So Kobe Bryant died last year, like on right before Super Bowl Sunday. And ultimately on February 24th of last year, I remember it was 224, which was significant numbers. They had like the ceremony to celebrate his death. And Shaq, your boy, gets up there and tells this fucking hysterical story. So he walks up there and he's like, Kobe's young, he's early in his career, and everybody's pissed at him because he's not passing the ball. And he's like, Shaq goes, I'll take it. I'll go talk to him. He goes, Kobe, there's no I in team. And Kobe goes, but there's an ME in that motherfucker. And Shaq walks over to two guys and goes, he ain't passing, you better get a rebound.
That's amazing. That's amazing. But there's a difference between private and public boasting also in between men and women. So there was a study done by a psychologist, Lori Hetherington. She went and interviewed hundreds of incoming college students. She asked them to predict what grades they would get in their first year. And what she found is there was a big difference in the predictions when there was a public or a private pronouncement. So she found that women, when asked to predict their grades in a public forum, in a group forum, gave themselves almost a full grade lower on average than the boys. But when they all did it privately, where they didn't have to do it in front of a group, it was about equal between the men and the girls. And I think where that can hurt a woman, that's all business is. You're always being asked to commit to things. You're always being asked to what's your commitment for the quarter? What's your commitment for the year? How far do you think you can get? And if you're always downgrading yourself when you're being asked in a public forum to do something like that, you're looked at as not confident. You're looked at as someone with a self-confidence problem or an assertiveness problem. So you have to be conscious. If you're a woman listening to this, you have to be conscious of the fact that by downgrading yourself and there's someone else that you're competing with for a promotion or pay, and it's a man, there's a good chance that he's not doing that. There's a good chance that he's confidently putting out there a prediction, whether he can make it or not. And that's coming across as confident whether he makes it or not. That's coming across as someone who believes in himself more than someone who wouldn't put themselves out there.
So there's a book called Tightrope, and Tightrope is a book about it's kind of in the same vein as Dope Sick and Hillbilly Elegy. And it's about just, Americana and where we rank in the world and things along these lines. And we don't rank very high in a lot of statistical categories. We're 10 to 30 in almost everything. And with our resources and our size and what we have, we should be higher. But there is one thing that we rank incredibly high in. Do you know what it is, Ian?
No.
Number one, most self-confident humans in the entire world are Americans. And that's men and women. So comparatively to anybody else, we have higher self-confidence than anybody. Now, I think men are worse at this than women. And statistically, what we just talked about, that it proves out. So what Ian's talking about in the public boasting is, as a society, we are boasters. And not only are we boasters, men are way more at this than women. And what my wife came in and talked about, we have the statistics to back this up. A 24-year-old, I remember my boss coming in when I was 24 years old and saying, well, I don't have the skills to be CEO. And I remember thinking to myself, I'll do the job. I mean, I was not qualified. I would have been terrible. But I remember being so full of myself that I would have taken that. But women, in almost every instance, and Ian can talk about this more than I can, men are volunteering for promotions, and women are often talking themselves out of them or saying no. And this comes down to the public boasting thing, where they feel like they need to master something more than a man does. And what ultimately happens is the self-promotion, the alliances, the communication, these things all start to line up. And what ends up happening is women find themselves less in roles of leadership and power because of these factors.
Man, that's so accurate. So having worked in a business with more females than males, I saw this over and over. I cannot recall any time in my career where I had to convince a man that they were ready for the next job. So this gets into Peter Principle a little bit. But I can't remember ever having to go to a guy and saying, no, really, you're ready. And I'm saying, I just don't, I think I need more time. I think I need more time in the role. Now, maybe a guy didn't want the job and just flat told me that job seems uninteresting to me. But I can't recall a time where I ever had to give someone confidence that, yes, you're ready. But I could rattle off, if I wanted to right now, a dozen names of females that I believed were ready to take on a bigger role who tried to turn it down. In most cases, I was persuasive enough to get them to take the job. And in almost every case, they kicked ass and did a great job. I'm not going to list their names right now because this is a public forum, but I could tell you the names because I remember being so frustrated. And there are some people I could tell you that I had to do it 3 and 4 times, Frankie, where no, you are ready for that job. Come on, you can do it. Have a long conversation. They go in that job, they kick ass. Then I'm trying to promote them again 2 years later. No, I'm not ready. Yes, you are. We've been through this. Promote them, kick ass. 3rd time. Are you going to make me beg you again? And I saw it come up over and over where men were usually overconfident in their ability to do the next job, and women downgraded themselves on a more frequent. Now, there were exceptions. There were plenty of very aggressive females, but another thing when I say the word aggressive, also, I have a really good example here. So this was like 2006. I promoted 2 salespeople into sales management positions. One was in Richmond, one was in Fairfax, and they were one was a young guy in his probably mid-20s, and one was a young girl in her mid-20s. Both were crazy talented, both were really smart, both were really accomplished, and both were aggressive and assertive people. So the female was a little bit different. She was more of the alpha, like a guy. She acted a little more like it. And what's really interesting is after about 6 months they were getting the same direction from me. I was their boss. I was giving them direction on how to handle things, what to do. They would come to me. They'd say, here's how I'm going to approach this. I would say, that makes sense. I felt like they were going about their job the same way. After 6 months, the girl who was promoted, her team was rebelling. And both the men and the women, the older guys were like, I don't like the way she talks to me. I feel like she talks over me. She's too direct. The women were complaining about her. And I kept hearing the word bossy over and over and over again. The guy down in Richmond who was approaching it the same way, he was looked at as decisive. He was a decisive leader. I like that. He's a no nonsense, no bullshit kind of guy. And I like that. He's direct, and I like direct. And they both approached it the same way. One team rebelled. The other team, they got what they kind of expected out of a male manager. So there's also this, Frankie, expectation of how a female manager should behave and how a male manager should behave because of social norms.
And how you're conditioned, what you think's going to happen. Like most of the people probably thought in that Richmond branch, that man's going to come in and he's going to be the boss. And some of the people rebelled against the woman in Fairfax because she acted like the boss and they probably weren't prepared for it. So it comes down to the social norms. It comes down to what you're conditioned to receive. That's why what we thought was a bullshit blow-off episode that would have just been fun turned into something incredibly serious. And that's why this woman is world-renowned, Deborah Tannen, because she has taken these things and spent 5 decades analyzing them. And the more you look, there's difference between men and women, managers and non-managers, mothers and daughters, all these different things that you can analyze because that's it. Most of the problems that people have in their marriages come down to communication. That's where like there's entire industries of psychologists and like marriage coaches, and it all comes down to talking. And that's what we're talking about here in a broader context about the subject.
So another finding from Deborah Tannen's research was a stark difference in a woman's willingness to ask questions in groups versus a man's willingness to ask questions in groups. And a lot of this comes right back to social norms. If in a group, if only one person asks questions, he or she risks being seen as the only ignorant person, the only person. And I think that's on both sides. There's kind of this fear of being the only person that asked a question. If everyone's quiet, the assumption is they know what they're talking about. So wrong, right, or indifferent, we tend to judge others, not just by how they speak, but also how they're spoken to. And the person who asks questions may end up getting lectured to and looking like a novice under some schoolmaster's tutelage. But the way boys are socialized makes them much more likely to be aware of this underlying power dynamic by which, a question asker can be seen in a one down, drop down position. If you ask a question, you can be perceived as losing status because someone might have to explain something and be your teacher. She was looking at a practicing physician who kind of learned the hard way that any exchange of info can become the basis for judgments about competence. During her training, she received a negative evaluation as physician, and she thought it was unfair. So she asked her boss for an explanation. He said that you seem to know less than your peers. And she was kind of stunned by this and said, "How did you come to that conclusion?" And he said, "Well, you ask a lot more questions," which doesn't mean that she knows less. It just means she's more, to me, and I guess I see this a little different, but maybe I do have some unconscious bias. I love people that raise their hand and ask questions in a group because they just seem to me like they have more guts. And you and I are both public speakers, Frank. And if you've ever been a speaker or someone who's run meetings, you don't want to do all the talking. So you appreciate people that are not afraid to raise their hand. But in group settings, that can be perceived as a lack of knowledge, right? It's the same way men don't like to ask for directions when we're driving. And a woman will always just be like, "Pull over. Let me ask someone." It's like, don't do that, because we care about being perceived as someone who knows what they're doing and in charge. Whereas a woman doesn't care much about that. They want the right answer. They want to get to where they're going.
So it's funny you mentioned that. So one of the things that I always heard about myself in feedback sessions when I was a younger employee or manager at NVR and Ryan Homes is that I wasn't afraid to ask questions. And when I think about this, and when we were reading this in prep, one of the things that I thought about a lot is when I was a kid, I more resembled my mom. I had her characteristics and I had her traits. I am more my dad now. As a 46-year-old, I'm grumpier. I'm more firm. I'm less open-minded. Like, I know these things are happening, but like
thick mustache.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My dad's behind me, by the way, in the pictures. If you can see this, it's with a poncho on. It's incredible. But the point is, when I was younger, I was more like my mom, and I was raised to ask questions. So, like the jokes about stopping for directions, I'll stop for directions. Like, that's ingrained in me because of my mom and how I was raised. But when I got to the corporate setting, I was fortunate enough to be with managers who were good enough to understand that I was competent, I was working hard, and I was asking questions because I wanted to reduce the learning curve and I wanted to contribute. And that's where it always came from. With bad managers and what you just read about this physician, that's the kind of example of someone who's just tone deaf. And he says, "You're asking questions, so you're dumb," which is bad management. But fortunately for us, we had good management and we stood out because we were willing to ask those questions. So the social norms of it are part of it. Now, asking too many questions, you do seem needy and stupid. Like, I'll just say that. Like, we've got people who are too needy and asking tons of questions. But by and large, if you have an aptitude for performance and you're asking questions, you're looked at as smarter. And that's how
there's also, Frank, I think there's also something here in that you're going against type. Yep. So if people know the norm is that a guy shouldn't ask questions in a group, and then someone comes along like you, big guy, strong guy, smart, doing well, and you're asking questions, you're seen as fearless because you're going against type. You're doing something that would could jeopardize your standing. And the fact that you're asking questions in a group shows that you are really self-confident. Whereas if a woman does that, no one's seeing that against type. They might think of that person as, ditzy or ignorant or not able to pick up on things as fast. So I think part of you getting kudos for asking questions was you were just going against the type of your gender.
Perhaps. But the thing of it is it was embraced because I had the right leadership. Like you and I have talked in a previous podcast about like sticking it to your boss or when do you shut up in front of your manager. I realized pretty early that I was rewarded for acting in this way, and I continued to. But I've been in situations where acting this way, and it's funny, when I had a woman manager earlier in my career who used to give me a bunch of flack, I stopped talking and asking questions because it wasn't received very well. So knowing your audience and where you are is critical.
Love it. So apologizing. Women tend to say I'm sorry at 3 times the rate of men in social situations. And it's a ritual that girls learn at a very early age to establish rapport. But people who utter frequent apologies may end up appearing weaker, less confident, more blameworthy than people who don't. On the other side of it, as a manager, if you don't take blame ever, it can frustrate employees who refuse to accept responsibility or admit mistakes. So boys in general are not going to admit they made a mistake as frequently as women, because that can be seen as a downgrade to your status, right? So you just don't talk about it. You don't say that you did anything wrong. You don't admit to it going wrong. Little things like if your phone is the reason why a call dropped, a woman is much more likely to say, I'm sorry, that was me. And a guy is more likely to just jump on the phone and say, what happened? And then move on. That's just, they've studied the hell out of it. Like guys, because we're conditioned not to say, I'm sorry. Don't lead with I'm sorry. Don't apologize, because that's admitting wrong, that's kind of the politician's way of doing things.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much more to add there. I think if you're a man and you're in a position where you do make a mistake and you say you're sorry, especially in a work setting, I think it sets you apart, because I think in a lot of instances, men are fairly stubborn. And at the same time, Deborah Tannen goes into this in detail about the apology between a man and a woman and how much value it has most of the time for the woman, and comparatively how little value it has to the man. So understanding the power of it, utilizing the word when needed, being socially aware around I'm sorry, I think is a big thing.
That's good. So compliments and feedback. So every study showed that women pay more compliments than men, period. And in addition, men are much less likely to ask, what did you think of my performance? Because the question invites a potential status one down, whereas a woman is more likely to ask because they're used to getting answers that would preserve the status quo, that are rapport building. And so there's 2 things on this. One, a man might not get as much feedback as he wants because he's protecting his ego. And any men listening to this should think about that naturally you're going to be inclined not to ask, how did I do? And to avoid feedback, whereas a woman's going to go get it. The other side of it, a woman who does ask for it, you're talking to a man most of the time, 72% of the time. And a man is not going to be as likely to try to protect your feelings. If you ask a man, a boss, about your performance, don't be just fishing for a compliment, because you're more likely out of a man to get a really honest, direct, look you in the eyes, tell you how your performance went. And if they didn't feel like it went well, you're more likely to get something that you're not ready for. So be careful in who you ask. And if you're a man, know that you're conditioned not to ask for feedback, and that could hold you back as well.
I mean, I think you nailed it. I don't think there's anything to add.
So, lastly, just in leadership, they did a study of 100 men and women in leadership positions, and the women showed more concern about subordinates' feelings when they were playing the role of superior. So in other words, the women were more careful to save face for the other person when they were managing down than when they were managing up. And so I think I saw this, at least I felt like women were much better at much less likely I would have to get involved when some tough feedback was involved with a female manager than I would with a male manager, because they're not as in tune to that person's feelings. And it was less likely that the conversations was left with hard feelings. I don't know if you've noticed that, Frank, or not.
I have. I think instead of saying specifically here in leadership and with the feelings piece, I think you've got to be mindful who you're talking to. I think leadership boils down to who's delivering the message and who's receiving the message. And you need a multitude of deliveries if you have a multitude of people who work for you. I have basically 7 different divisions, and how I talk across divisions is quite different. The skill set is different. The mentality is different. The vocabulary is different. The expectations are different. So in a leadership role, I think it's very important to understand where you're at, who's there, who works there, and speak in that manner in that group. And I think I used this reference earlier. I think we all have examples of seeing it done wrong, and we've had examples of it seeing it done properly, but it's critically important to adjust what comes out of your mouth for the audience.
So, as a wrap up, I would say on both sides, because we do have boys and girls that listen to our show, the dozens and dozens of people that are tuning in now weekly. If you are a female, understand that in business, it is still largely a man's world. And that is not a chauvinistic thing. That is statistically speaking. 41 of 500 Fortune 500 companies have a female CEO. That is highly underrepresented. At the CEO level, men outnumber women by 17-1. That 28% are senior vice presidents. So this is something you have to understand. And if you have big ambitions, you have to get over some of these things you've been conditioned, and you have to be comfortable in speaking in a way that a man will give you credit for things. And if you're a male listening to this, females are dramatically underrepresented. And that's not a good way to run a business. Like you could be passing on some of your absolute best talent, and you could be making assumptions about people that might make incredible leaders that will make you a lot of money, which is really, that's what we're talking about here in business, is making a profitable business. You could be passing on people that are better candidates than the men you're promoting because of your own biases that you're not seeing. And you could be making assumptions about people, about their confidence, about their approach, about their attitude, about their intelligence, about their knowledge, because of a different conversational style that you just haven't recognized. Because like Frank, we both were really excited to get on here and make a big joke about mansplaining. And I'm going to give Ellie Cava a lot of credit, which I normally don't like to do, but she did a good job of changing my mind on a topic that I'd kind of made my mind up about that was bullshit. And the more I studied into this, all of it made sense. And the audio definitely matched the video from my 20 years as a manager working at 2 Fortune 500 companies.
What I'll say is this. I agree with what you said, and I have nothing different to say. I have just a different perspective in which to say it. If you are a woman who has upward desires career-wise, I think it's important to talk about positioning yourself well. one of the things that Ian and I have talked about many times, and is a common theme, is who you align yourself with. So as a woman with upward aspirations in a male-dominated workplace, I think it's incredibly important to make sure you have male supporters and cheerleaders who believe in you. Now, I find that person to be rare. I don't see tons of those examples, but if you are one of those examples, I think that's the path forward. And figuring out how to take the sharp edges off of the presentation to make it fit, like Ian's manager from Richmond, we don't want that situation, but we want to make it so you can get promoted. On the other side, and I think this is a broader part of our audience, if you are a male, understand that many women have felt dejected or have been demoted mentally or specifically in their careers prior to getting to you. So if you are an open-minded manager, which I hope you are, you may have to encourage women to take more responsibility. I've had to deal with this several times in my career. And what I can tell you, and Ian has given several examples today, what I can tell you is you're rewarded as a manager by putting belief in someone. It doesn't matter to me what your sex is. It matters to me what you can do. I often have to temper the enthusiasm of males, and I often have to help support women. But by so doing, I feel like I have an incredibly diverse and I have an incredibly strong leadership team made up of men, women, all different colors, because the people, I look at what's the performance and what do you need from me to get better? And that's what it takes to be a great leader. So wherever you are in this dialogue, understand it, relate to it, use situational awareness, and figure out how to get what it is that you want. And in most instances, what I can tell you is what people in business want is success. So if you can figure out how to help generate winning and success, no matter where you are, it's going to lead you to the right spot.
I mean, you mansplained that perfectly, brother. That was a great closing by you.
I find that to be hysterical because if we did a Venn diagram on speaking, you talked a lot more than me today. I was going to give you some shit for mansplaining this one to me.
I typically do talk more than you, and that's more because I actually prepare for these rather than just showing up in my pajamas, you a-hole. That's nothing to do with mansplaining.
But look how comfortable I look.
You do look comfortable. So, hey, whether you are a male or female, hit subscribe and give us a 5-star review with some comments. We just got 5 new comments this week. We got 5 new 5 stars this week. I'm pretty excited about it. So some of you are sticking around to hear my begging at the end of these. So it mean a lot to us if you would give us that. Frankie, good hanging out with you, dude.
Always a pleasure, Ian.
See you.
See you, bro.